unit test. In your OpenStax textbook, this is Chapter 8. If you're using the ushistory.org notes, it's Chapter 17 to 19. Those the outlines. Section 17 to 19. The first thing we need to do for the 1790s is set up the new government. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in May of 1788, is now the governing constitutional document for the country, and it separates the federal government into three branches: the executive, judicial, and legislative branch. So, the executive branch, you have the election of 1789. The first thing we need to know is how the Electoral College worked during the 1790s. Number one, every elector had 2 votes. Okay, so just like today, 6 weeks after Election Day, electors picked by state legislatures at the time would go to the state capitol 6 weeks after the election and vote for their candidate for president and vice president. The first place vote getter became president. The second place vote getter became vice president. Okay. In the election of 1789, George Washington received the most electoral votes. He's often called. It's often told that he won unanimously. What that means is at least one elector. That means every elector picked him at least once. There were 69 electors in the first presidential election. So what that means is he was elected unanimously. Every elector used one of their 2 votes to pick George Washington as president. The second place vote getter in that election was John Adams. He became the vice president. Again, to review, in the 1790s, state legislatures picked electors. Each elector had 2 votes. They'd vote for one for president, one for vice president. Just like today, they met in the state capitol 6 weeks after Election Day. In the election of 1789, George Washington got the most electoral votes, and John Adams got the second. So that's the president. The U.S. Constitution states that the president can, with the confirmation of Senate, can have a group of advisors or a cabinet. So Vice President John Adams. The Washington administration created 3 cabinet offices, and the U.S. Senate confirmed these appointments. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of War Henry Knox. So you have the executive branch set up. Next, you have the judicial branch. The U.S. Constitution is open and vague. It doesn't really detail what a judicial branch should look like. The writers of the Constitution left it to the new government to create a judicial branch or a federal judiciary. Keep in mind, we already have state judicial systems, right? Virginia, how long has Virginia been around? 1607. We're now in 1789, 1790. So Virginia's had a judicial system for 100, 50, 60 years. Massachusetts, the 1620s. We're now in the 1790s. And so state judicial systems are already very well established. And so the founders, the writers of the Constitution, signers of the Constitution, they're creating a federal judiciary, and they leave it rather vague as to what a federal judiciary should look like, leaving it to the hands of Congress, right? So the states send people to Congress, and so Congress will then kind of hash out what a federal judiciary would look like. And again, you already have state judicial systems, and so you're trying to balance that power between state judicial systems and a federal judiciary. Congress passes the Judiciary Act of 1789. It sets the Supreme Court at 6 members, not 9 like it is today. The original number is 6. Unlike today, back then with the Judiciary Act of 1789, a Supreme Court justice was also oversaw a federal district court. And that's a little different than today. Today, a Supreme Court justice does not sit on a district court. The Judiciary Act of 1789 begins to attempt to try to set up jurisdiction. What's a federal case and what is a state case. And so you start trying to set up that. And we, constitutional law, American society, we argue about that all the time today. So that's a debate about, like, what's a federal case, what is the federal judiciary responsibility versus the state. That's an argument that we still argue about today. The U.S. Constitution sets up the legislative branch, a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. You have the first Congress meeting in 1789 to 1791, right? Congresses last 2 years each. So the first Congress, 1789 to 91, we're on like the current Congress. It's in the hundreds. It's like, I don't know, 115. I didn't look it up. I haven't looked it up in the last little bit, but every Congress is 2 years. So every congressional election starts a new Congress. So the first Congress is 1789 to 91. Okay. There's no organized political parties early on in the early 1790s, and so when we break down the partisan breakdown of the first Congress, there's no real political party. So usually historians break it down to supporters of ratification of the U.S. Constitution and opponents of ratification. The first Congress, the members of the first Congress were congressmen, were elected officials that heavily favored ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And so the first Congress are people that supported ratification, were excited about it, wanted to, let's go. There are very few members of the first Congress that didn't support ratification. So in other words, when the U.S. had its first congressional elections, the winners of those congressional elections were candidates that supported the U.S. Constitution and thought it was the fantastic thing. The economy. Enter Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. During Washington's first term, Congress asked Alexander Hamilton to develop a plan for the maintaining of the U.S. economy. The American economy is still struggling from the economic downturns from after the American Revolution. The American Revolution, we're in like 1790. We're in 1790, 1791. And so the American Revolution ended, the treaty is 1781. So we're almost 20 years later. The U.S. economy is kind of still struggling along. Congress, wanting to use the power of this new government to right the economy, asked Alexander Hamilton to come up with a legislative plan that could get the U.S. economy healthy again. So Hamilton's program is extremely important to understand. The goal of Hamilton's program is to ensure the loyalty of the wealthy and the elite to the federal government, to ensure economic stability. And so when you study Alexander Hamilton's writings, his opinions, his political and economic philosophy, for Hamilton, the engine of the U.S. economy would be dollars, the money, gold and silver, the U.S. money's currency would be the money from the wealthy and the elite. Would get the government going, and it would help the wealthy and elite kind of be more loyal to the government and, get it going and get the economy right again. Hamilton's program involved, these are the highlights. They involved a small national debt to restore credit. We got to maintain our credit worthiness. No one trusts the U.S. government with money. And so Hamilton says we need to have a small national debt to restore credit, to show people we can be trusted with money. Just so you know, that is a radical idea in the 18th century. The prevailing economic opinion is you should not be in debt as a government because you become a slave to your creditors. And so, you don't want to be in debt. So Hamilton's kind of bucking the conventional wisdom of the era. The U.S. Constitution gives the federal government power to tax. Right? And remember, that was one of the concerns of anti-federalists, was you're giving this government power. States already tax us. Why are you going to have the federal government tax us to raise money? And so Hamilton's idea is, well, the U.S. government needs money. The federal government needs money to run. So tax. Use your power. That is the whiskey tax. Okay, in a little bit we'll talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. But you're going to tax whiskey. Right? A little bit of alcohol history. Rum is no longer, by the 1790s, rum is no longer the number one drink of Americans. A new alcoholic beverage has developed and become popular in America. Whiskey. It's cheaper to make. It apparently gets you smashed harder. Okay, quicker. So it's a lot more popular. Rum, wealthy people still drink rum, but whiskey becomes the popular drink of most Americans. Alexander Hamilton does not drink rum. He does not drink alcohol. Alexander Hamilton does not drink whiskey. Okay, so it tells you a little bit something about it. Upper class people still drink rum. That was a fancy drink. Scotch, rum, brandy. Those were the fancy drinks. Regular Americans, poor Americans, Westerners, living in the backwoods, whiskey. Okay, easy to make, cheap to make, and gets you smashed a whole lot harder. So, remember that. So it kind of makes sense. Hamilton would say, well, let's tax whiskey. Okay, most Americans drink it. Next, the Bank of the United States. This is very controversial for the time period. For anti-federalists, for people that did not support ratifying the U.S. Constitution, this is a big issue. We already have state banks, and we don't trust them. So banks are viewed, for a lot of people, at the time, banks are viewed as corrupting, where the wealthy and the elite can concentrate their power. So banks are not looked up to, not like, no banks are out. And so for Hamilton suggests we should have a national bank. For opponents of the U.S. Constitution, ratification of the U.S. Constitution, this was like, we're right. Hamilton and Federalists want to create a tyrannical federal government. Okay, that's going to oppress people. We're going to be fighting the second American, we're going to be fighting another American Revolution here soon. But instead of the British, it'll be our own government. Well, they were our own government too, but instead of the British government, it's going to be the Federalist government, right? And then we're going to assume state debts to ensure loyalty of the wealthy and the elite. Rather than the states paying your debts, we will do it. Hamilton's political opponents argued that he wanted to get rid of states. And this is an example. This was the argument. And it's an exaggeration. He didn't necessarily want to kill. He didn't necessarily want to get rid of states, but Hamilton did want to subordinate states to the federal government. So that's true. His political opponents went as far as saying he wants to destroy states altogether. He just wants there to be one national United States, one national federal government that oppresses and tyrannizes everyone. And that's an exaggeration, but it is true that in Hamilton's point of view, the federal government was the top, and states were definitely subordinate to the federal government. And one example of that is state debts. We're going to take over assuming state debts, you're taking over the economy to some extent. You're taking over a state's ability to control its economy, its budget to some extent, by saying we're going to assume state debts. Next question, or next item, development of political parties. On your second test, you're going to have a question, development of political parties. Here you go. Okay. This is what we'll focus on. The emergence of opposition. Okay, so Hamilton has shared his views on how to get the economy going again. Right? So Congress people, they read his proposals, his reports, and so they start arguing in Congress. They start debating and arguing about Hamilton's policies. Opponents of Alexander Hamilton, politicians or statesmen, whatever, elected officials that tended to not like or tended to oppose ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Hamilton proves their worst nightmare. And so opponents of Alexander Hamilton, opponents of ratification of the U.S. Constitution, really start to coalesce. The emergence of the opposition is this idea that for a lot of anti-federalists or people that didn't support ratification of the U.S. Constitution, Alexander Hamilton's policies, ideas, were the exact reason you do not want to ratify the U.S. Constitution. And so you see opponents, not just in Congress, but in public too. People start dividing up. The newspaper editorials, regular people start dividing up over Hamilton's economic policies. Okay. For Federalists, Hamilton's policy is a godsend. It's exactly what we need to get the country going again. For opponents of ratification of the U.S. Constitution, it proves them right. They're right. We were right. We were right. The U.S. government is going to become tyrannical, oppressive, subvert the states, subvert the will of the people. Okay? So that's the emergence of opposition. Hamilton's policies. You could make the argument that Alexander Hamilton's policies single-handedly created political parties. There's more details to that. There's more details. It's a simplification, but you could make a strong argument that Hamilton's economic policies single-handedly created political parties. So that's the emergence of opposition. The Jefferson-Hamilton bargain. There's kind of two parts to this. There's two parts to the Jefferson-Hamilton bargain. So Thomas Jefferson is Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury. They do not like each other, politically or personally. Okay? Jefferson's from Virginia. He's a planter from Virginia. Hamilton's a New Yorker. Jefferson's always been wealthy, came from a wealthy family. Hamilton, he started out poor. We're not sure who his mother was. His mother may have, why should we say? We know who his mother was. We know who his father was. He was a bastard. He was born out of wedlock. We don't, he had dubious parentage. He was born poor in the Caribbean, the West Indies, and came to America, worked his way up. Hamilton So you very different political ideologies, very different personalities. Jefferson's more quiet and reserved. Hamilton's brash, arrogant. Hamilton has a lot of enemies. Okay. How many enemies, Mr. Bills? Let me put it this way. Aaron Burr wasn't the only one that wanted to shoot Alexander Hamilton. So that's your hint there. There was a line to shoot Hamilton. Burr just got there first. So anyways, so Jefferson and Hamilton, they're political opponents in the executive branch, right? The Jefferson-Hamilton bargain is, number one, they stop arguing long enough that will encourage Jefferson to run for president again. Washington's first term, he almost didn't run for re-election because he got sick of the arguing between Jefferson and Hamilton. Just bad. And so that's one. The second aspect is Hamilton, there's a good amount of opposition in Congress for Hamilton's plan. Because even among Hamilton's supporters, some of his policies are pretty radical. The Jefferson-Hamilton bargain is if Jefferson will support passage of some of Hamilton's ideas, Hamilton will support moving the U.S. Capitol from New York to a southern location, a new city, a new capital city, known as, what will be known as what? The District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. Okay, so that's the Jefferson-Hamilton bargain. So I've already gone over the executive. How do political parties develop in the executive branch? Well, Hamilton and Jefferson have two very different visions of America. Okay, they don't like each other personally. They don't like each other politically. So the executive branch starts splitting up between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson and Hamilton come to symbolize the leaders of their parties or their teams. So that's how political parties kind of develop in the executive branch. Right? Jefferson and Hamilton, they're arguing so much, very different visions of America. They're going to become leaders of their teams, team captains. Congress, we just went over. As Congress argues over Hamilton's policies, they start dividing up. They start organizing. People that realize, hey, we vote the same way. We're from the same part of the country. We have similar ideas about government in the U.S. Constitution. So they start working together, right? Opponents of Hamilton start going, we've got to stop Hamilton. So they start organizing to stop Hamilton. Right? And then it spills into the public, right? Jefferson and Hamilton's executive branch squabbles go out into the public as Jefferson and Hamilton try to garner public support for their policies, as Hamilton tries to garner public support for his congressional ideas that he wants Congress to pass. So the public starts dividing up. As people read the papers of the day, they start arguing about, who's the best, Jefferson or Hamilton. You start dividing up into teams. And newspapers back then were openly partisan. Today they just lie to you, but today they lie to you and say they're not partisan when they are. They're hyper-partisan. But back in the 18th and 19th century, papers were openly partisan, and everyone knew it, and everyone was fine. It was because if you didn't like a party, if you didn't like a newspaper's editorial slant, often you just start your own paper. So papers were pretty openly partisan, and people, that's how it is. Politics is entertainment, and everyone's going to pick a side and argue your point of view, right? You have the creation of democratic Republican societies. Jefferson's supporters create these clubs across the U.S. in different towns and cities. Jefferson's supporters formed Democratic Republican clubs or societies. They would have parades. They'd have parades, the barbecues, get people out. You know, if you remember, electors are picked by state legislatures. U.S. senators at the time are picked by state legislatures. So these Democratic Republican societies would support candidates that like Jefferson, or like Jefferson's policies. So if you voted for your state legislature, you were also you were also voting for like your U.S. senator and who you wanted your electors to be. Because you would vote for the senator, you'd vote for the state legislator that would go to the state legislature and pick the U.S. senator you liked. And so you have Jefferson supporters and Hamilton supporters. The Whiskey Rebellion also sets off divisions in American society. The Whiskey Rebellion, Western Pennsylvania farmers, we talked about them before, Western Pennsylvania farmers decide they're not going to pay the whiskey tax, right? Just like the Federalists, George Washington and the Federalist government have become just like the British, oppressive, tyrannical, taking away our rights, forcing us to pay taxes. So Western Pennsylvania farmers start saying, not only are we not going to pay taxes, we're going to get back into our Revolutionary War uniforms and march on Washington. New York at the time. New York. We're going to march on the government. All right. President George Washington, sends out the army. Then, sends out the army, brings in the Continental Army, the state militias supporting the Continental Army, they send them out to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And again, for anti-federalists, for people that opposed ratification of the U.S. Constitution, this is another big deal. The federal government is so strong, it can enforce things, unpopular policies, like the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay? Compare and contrast that to Shays' Rebellion a decade earlier. S-H-A-Y apostrophe S. Right. The French Revolution is going to get people bent out of shape and divided up. And when the French Revolution started, it was generally popular in the U.S. Everyone loved it. It was fantastic. France was doing what we did. We revolted against the corrupt government. Well, the French are doing the same thing. Right? After 1792, though, que problema. The French Revolution becomes very violent. They start cutting heads off, the king on down. They become very, quote-unquote, radical, okay, in their progressive pursuit for democracy. And so here in America, after 1792, you have a division. As people go, the French Revolution is bad, it's gone too far. So they're saying, it's still a good revolution. It's there's liberty and freedom for people. All right. So that's going to divide up American society quite a bit. On the test, we'll need to talk about the first party system. You don't have to talk about every single item. You can talk about Federalists and Democratic Republicans are our first two political parties, the first party system. I caution against trying to compare it to modern day parties. Students try to do that, and it doesn't work. It breaks down. Modern day current Democrat and Republican and Democrat policies don't nicely fit either one of these, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So, I will say this. In general, modern day Democrats technically like the Democratic Republican Party. But what's hilarious about that is Democratic Republicans were for small government. Modern day Democrats want big government. So it's not a one-to-one easy to fit. And I gave you one example. When you talk to people that are registered Democrats today, modern day Democrats, a lot of them will claim the Democratic Republican Party. But the problem is, what's funny is, the modern day Democrat Party, in some ways, is the exact opposite of the Democratic Republicans. Like, almost the opposite in some ways. And so you want to be careful about, kind of making modern day one-on-one. It's not a one-on-one comparison. Federalists were men like Adams, Washington, Hamilton. For them, like banks, national debt, high tariffs are okay. Federalists want a strong national government. Taxes, regulation, to govern. A strong military, purpose of the government to maintain order. When Federalists read the U.S. Constitution, they tended to be what's called loose constructionist, meaning if it didn't necessarily need to say it in the document. Okay. Federalists in the 1790s, early 1800s were strong in the North and the East. All right. Democratic Republicans tended to be Southern and Westerners. They wanted the opposite. They wanted small government, weak government. They were strict constructionists. One reason why Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans opposed the bank, the U.S. bank, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that the federal government should create a national bank. They're strict constructionists. Hamilton reads the document and comes up with whatever he wants. Right? For Democratic Republicans, they're strict constructionists. Right? And that's another example. Like modern day Democrats, the modern day Democrat Party would be loose constructionists. Democrats read the U.S. Constitution and read all kinds of things into it. Republicans tend to be strict constructionists. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. So that's another example of a flip. Like modern day Democrats want to talk like they would like the Democratic Republican Party. You wouldn't. It would be almost the exact opposite of what you think. Democratic Republicans were strict constructionists. If it didn't say it, you couldn't do it. The modern day Democratic Party are loose constructionists. Modern day Democrats read all kinds of stuff into the U.S. Constitution. And so you want to know those two things. So they're big in the South and the West. The Adams presidency, the election of 1796. John Adams is the first place vote getter. He's a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is the second place vote getter, and he will be the vice president. And so you have an interesting thing where you have a Federalist, John Adams, and a Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson, as your vice president. It would be like today, just for fun, not saying anything political, just for fun. So the 2020 election, first place vote getter in the Electoral College, Joe Biden president, second place vote getter, Donald Trump. So 2020 would be Joe Biden president, Donald Trump vice president. 2016, first place Electoral College vote getter, Donald Trump. Second place Electoral College vote getter, Hillary Clinton. So it'd be like Donald Trump president, Hillary Clinton vice president. Something like that. So election 2016, election 2012, Barack Obama president, second place vote getter, Mitt Romney vice president. So it'd be kind of like that. It would. So you'd have the two parties being president and vice president. So that's going to cause some issues. You go, why is Adams a one-term president? That'll be one of the reasons. You have, your government's a lot of opposition. Next, the XYZ affair. 1798. 1797, late 1797, 1798. 1797, 98. American diplomats are in France to negotiate a trade treaty. In the papers, they're called Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z, but three mysterious individuals attempt to bribe and or extort money out of these diplomats in order to see the French government. These diplomats are insulted. How dare an ally treat us like this? We gotta pay a bribe and then give money to the French government that we owe anyways, but it's bribery and extortion. I pay a bribe, and then we got to promise to pay the French government a bunch of money. It just happens to be the amount we owe them anyways. As these diplomats leave, they're upset. In the papers, it gets called the XYZ affair, as these diplomats just go nuts. Just go absolutely nuts. American public opinion, the famous saying is thousands for tribute. Thousands for tribute, not 1 cent for... thousands for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. Late in the day, but thousands for tribute, not 1 cent. Thousands in defense, for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. Americans want to go to war. The American populace wants to go to war. The Adams administration, even though they're pro-British, they don't really like the French. The Adams administration is like, we're not going to go to war with France over this. The American public wants to go to war. Public opinion, Adams is getting a lot of heat. Americans want to go to war. What the Adams administration authorizes, and this is the quasi-war with France, the Adams administration authorizes privateering. American merchants are allowed to pirate French shipping. So it's kind of an economic war. It's a couple of year kind of economic war. You're going after French ships. They're going after you. Adams takes a lot of heat. The Adams administration, a lot of criticism. Newspaper editorials lambasting him up and down, up one side, down the other. Not very popular. So the Federalist Congress wants to enact the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act makes it, doubles the amount of time you have to be a resident to be a citizen from 7 to 14 years. There's no grandfathering, so you could, like if you've been a resident for 10 years and, 7, you became a citizen, the Alien Act said, 14. So you have a lot of people, you have some people losing their citizenship because of the Alien Act. The Alien Act also gives the administration power to remove dangerous aliens. And who are the dangerous aliens? They just so happen to be Democratic, Republican newspaper editors. There are some people that will get deported. There are some newspaper editors that will get deported under the Alien Act. The Sedition Act, jail and fines for criticizing the government. There are several examples of this. One famous case is a U.S. senator who criticized the government. He got put in jail. He was a U.S. senator criticizing the Adams administration. The Federalists in Congress and Federalists Adams want to make a example of him, put him in jail, and so the Sedition Acts go pretty far. Finding jail time for criticizing the administration. Funny story. You want some humor? The Federalist Congress, when they wrote the act, the Sedition Act, they listed the government people or departments or offices you couldn't criticize. Guess what they left off the list? Vice President Thomas Jefferson. They left off the Vice President's office. You could criticize that all you want. Who occupies it? Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. So, who says history's not funny? So that's an example there. The important item here is you have to understand the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Okay. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They are protest documents to Congress. They'll be published in newspapers as well. The legal theory behind the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is nullification. Before the Civil War, the idea of the doctrine of nullification is a very debated topic in the pre-Civil War America. Okay, a big debate. Modern day historians tend to downplay it mainly because Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army spent 4 years answering the question, who is supreme in the Union, the federal government, and so, and a lot of historians are kind of pro big government. They're kind of on that side of the political spectrum that likes government running everything, and so historians today don't really go into nullification a lot because Abraham Lincoln, made it a dead issue after a 4-year war. But anyway, so it is a legal debate. It is a debate before the Civil War. Some people argue that the federal government is supreme, and its laws are supreme, and states have to follow federal law. Alexander Hamilton, the states are subordinate to the federal government. Others argue that the states created the federal government, so no way the federal government can be no way that the states can be subordinate to the federal government. The states created the federal government. The states got together in convention and wrote the U.S. Constitution. So others argue that the states created the government, so at the very least they're co-equal. And then there's some that argue, well, the states are actually more superior, politically superior to the federal government. So that's an argument back then. Democratic Republicans James Madison and Jefferson argue for nullification. States have a right to nullify federal law. So we don't have to follow federal law if we deem it unconstitutional. Okay? And that's the debate. Is nullification a constitutional check on federal power? For Jefferson, Madison, and Democratic Republicans, nullification was just a check and balance. What is the U.S. government? What is our country based on? Division of powers, separation of powers. And so for proponents of nullification, nullification is just an example of that checks and balance. Nullification is simply a check on federal power. Other people like Hamilton said, no, that's too much power to the states. It's not a check on federal power. It gives the states the opportunity to tyrannize the federal government. And so you can see the political arguments there. So this concludes Lecture 10, the last lecture on the test. If you have any questions, email me. Have a great day.